Hey guys, welcome back to WrestleHouse 365. Hope everyone is doing very well. As always, there is a ton of news stories to get into today, so let's talk about Impact Wrestling. Let's talk about Jonah. He's made quite the splash, or senton, pun intended, however you want to go with it, since joining Impact Wrestling. Since at Turning Point, of course, he attacked Josh Alexander. I would assume, and I've mentioned this before, that we're going to get Jonah versus Josh Alexander at the pay-per-view in January, which I'm very excited to see as well. But we have some updates when it comes to his contractual status with Impact Wrestling, his contractual status with New Japan Pro Wrestling, if he's exclusive anywhere, what his future looks like, his details as to how he left WWE, a cancelled or scrapped appearance at Bound for Glory, which we kind of touched on before, but he's kind of confirmed it as well here. So I want to get into all of this. So Jonah, the aforementioned, formerly known as Bronson Reed in WWE NXT, former North American champion, of course, spoke to Fightful recently ahead of his New Japan Pro Wrestling Nemesis appearance on December 9th. Now, Jonah is still based out of Florida, which of course is where NXT WWE is. A lot of pro wrestlers nowadays are based out of Florida, especially if at any point they went through the Performance Center for a prolonged period of time, they're based in Florida. So that's kind of like the unofficial home of pro wrestling at this point, whether it's WWE's Performance Center or, of course, Jacksonville for AEW. That's pro wrestling in the United States, isn't it? It's in Florida. He did clarify, and we spoke about this before because Jonah did an interview previously with Nick Hausman of Wrestling Inc. Shout out, Nick. Great guy, great interview. I would recommend to check it out. That he alluded to, he didn't confirm it, but he alluded to that immigration issues, work visa issues were preventing him from doing certain appearances. That was at the beginning of November, late October, around that period of time. Now, he couldn't say specifically Impact Wrestling Bound for Glory. I was booked on that show, then unbooked, because he hadn't yet made his debut for Impact Wrestling. So he couldn't actually say Impact and all that kind of stuff and Bound for Glory and confirm the report that was going around right after Bound for Glory that he was booked for the show, then unbooked, and people are like, oh, what's going on? Could they not agree a deal? All that kind of stuff. He did confirm now in this interview with Fightful that what we were talking about was accurate. He said that immigration issues are what caused him to be booked and then unbooked for Bound for Glory. So that was the situation. He was booked. He was probably, I would assume, and I might be wrong here, but given how things have played out here, this is what I would suggest. That the angle we saw at Turning Point was probably meant to happen at the conclusion of Bound for Glory. So I think what we would have probably have seen is Josh Alexander win the Impact World Championship from Christian Cage, like we saw. Then Jonah would have come out, attacked Josh Alexander, done the sentons, Josh Alexander spitting out blood, all that kind of stuff. And then Moose would have cashed in the Call Your Shot gauntlet and won the Impact World Championship. I think with Jonah being booked and then unbooked, they just decided to kind of split those two angles apart and have what happened at Bound for Glory happen with Moose cashing in anyway, etc., and then have Jonah make his debut at Turning Point. I think that's the plan. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily completely accurate, but it makes logical sense, doesn't it? It makes logical sense. So that was the reason. So he's confirmed that as well. He spoke about how he's ended up in New Japan. He said that Rocky Romero, who of course does a lot of work with New Japan in the United States, even with going to Japan as well, booking those talents, etc., said that Rocky Romero reached out to him within a few days of his WWE release to extend that New Japan wanted him to work for the company. But this is a really key aspect here. This is a really key detail which explains how he's able to work for Impact and New Japan. Of course, we know that Impact Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling have this working relationship that's seen various contracted New Japan Pro Wrestling stars appear on Impact Wrestling television, whether it's Minoru Suzuki, FinJuice, El Phantasmo, Jay White, the list goes on and on. But he did specify, Jonah, that his deal with New Japan Pro Wrestling is non-exclusive and his priority is there ahead of anything else. So basically, he's got a contract with New Japan. That's the first place he signed. That's his first port of call. If New Japan need him somewhere on a certain date, that takes priority over everything else. But he does have the ability to work elsewhere in the United States. I don't think Japan, he probably has some kind of thing that he can't work for other Japanese companies in Japan or anything like that, so he's not going to show up in All Japan Pro Wrestling, which he does have a background in, of course. But I would assume it's like many United States-based New Japan Pro Wrestling contracts now. A lot of those guys, as I mentioned before, those people that are contracted do have these non-exclusive contracts. The barriers or the borders between pro wrestling companies stateside is so fluid right now. And I think AEW deserves a lot of credit for that, for really breaking down those barriers on a larger scale. But Impact and New Japan, of course, have this working relationship, and it allows Jonah to make these deals with Impact Wrestling as well. So, as he's mentioned there, his deal with New Japan is non-exclusive. but it takes priority. So if, for instance, New Japan and Impact have live events on the same day and New Japan say, we want you for this one, he has to take the New Japan one over Impact Wrestling. But they can figure those things out. He also mentioned this working relationship that I spoke about between New Japan Pro Wrestling and Impact Wrestling, helping him make the decision to work for both easier and how to sort of line up those schedules, figure these sort of things out. So he said the working relationship between New Japan and Impact helped make his decision to work for both companies easier. He also briefly touched on how he ended up in Impact Wrestling, how that deal came together. He said that D'Lo Brown was the one that contacted him to come into Impact, but didn't go into too much more detail about it. A couple of interesting notes that I do want to mention as well about his WWE release and his exit from the company. This has kind of been out there anyway. Jonah's actually been very open in speaking to the media since he was released by WWE. I mean, on that fateful day, when was it, May or July, whenever it was, during an episode of SmackDown, he was one of those NXT names that got released while SmackDown was on the air. It was insane. When that happened, he put out a tweet saying, just been released, but I'm ready to go, and called out all these companies. And since then, he's done a lot of interviews, and he's very well spoken, and he's very open. So he told Fightful that he was told about a day or so ahead of time he was going to be doing that dark match that he did on SmackDown. Remember at the time, Bronson Reed, Karrion Kross, I think Isaiah Swerve Scott, I think Tegan Nox maybe as well, Shotzi. All of these NXT names were doing dark matches before SmackDown and Raw events. Even in the Thunderdome, this is before they were even back on the road. I think Bronson Reed did one of the ones that was actually in the Thunderdome. Because he appeared on that episode of Main Event, didn't he, as the NXT North American champion. So he said that he was told about a day or so ahead of time he'd be doing this dark match. He then had a 15-minute meeting with Vince McMahon later that day. He said that Vince was very impressed with him, but he said that Vince impressed him with his knowledge of Australian wrestling and venues in Australia. The following week, McMahon told him he liked what he saw from the then Bronson Reed. He said that Johnny Ace and Bruce Pritchard both sat in that meeting, which Jonah felt was awkward. But when he got released, he called Shawn Michaels, who was surprised by the move, but Shawn Michaels told Jonah to make them regret their decision. He said he hasn't spoke to Triple H yet, but he hopes to once Triple H is healed up from his cardiac event. So again, there's no real new news there. I suppose when it comes to his WWE exit, he kind of spoken openly about that anyway. But I do find it interesting that, so he has the dark match that he was told a day or so before, is what it is. That's how WWE works. But then Vince McMahon in the meeting said, yeah, I like you. I really like you. Which really contrasts to the other reports that are out there saying that Vince McMahon saw the dark match, didn't like what he saw, and that was it. And that's very WWE. That's very, very WWE. I don't know, and you don't know what to believe. Vince is the ultimate Jedi mind trick guy. He will tell people to their face, convince them that he believes in them, all that kind of stuff. Remember the video of him and Keith Lee? After Keith Lee made his WWE debut, and they were filming, I think, a 24 documentary or something like that on Keith Lee at the time, and Vince McMahon's gassing him up backstage. He's going, you got to tweak some things. We've got a broader audience here, but I like what you saw. You got to make me believe in you. All this kind of stuff. And I'm sure he does that to everyone. And people have these meetings with him, and they come out and they're like, Vince believes in me, and I believe in Vince. Let's go. And then they get released a couple of weeks later or whatever. And that's the case of Jonah here. So I don't know. I don't know if it's McMahon liked him, or if it was Johnny Ace didn't like him, or Bruce Pritchard didn't like him. I wouldn't be stunned, to be honest with you, if Bruce Pritchard didn't like him, because I think that Bruce Pritchard probably looks at Jonah and just goes, oh, he's a fat guy. What about him? He's nothing. But I think, like Shawn Michaels said, prove them wrong, make them regret their decision. And I'm sure he will. I'm sure he will. All of these releases. I bet there are so many of these releases right now that WWE regret their decisions on already. And credit to Jonah. I think he's going to do great things in Impact Wrestling. Like I said, I think he's going to have a great match with Josh Alexander. And specifically in New Japan, I think he's going to do very, very well. When Jonah was first released, I mentioned that I think he could go to Impact, certainly. But also, I think he would fit just so well in New Japan, because once we get to that point where we can start traveling, and hopefully, one day, but where the travel is easier to Japan and all that kind of stuff, the big foreign heel doing sentons and making people bleed internally, it's money. It's absolute money. It's historically been money in Japan, and it will be money whenever it can happen again. So I'm excited to see that. I certainly am. I want to talk about the IInspiration. Yes, the IInspiration, the formerly known as the Iconics, of course, in WWE. They did an interview recently, and they spoke about how they landed in Impact Wrestling and their WWE departure as well. And, of course, they're the Knockouts Tag Team Champions at the moment. So Impact Wrestling Knockouts Tag Team Champions Jessie McKay and Cassie Lee recently spoke with Justin Barrasso of Sports Illustrated and talked about how it was, quote, a very scary time when they were released by WWE back in April of this year. Now, of course, formerly known as the Iconics and now known as the IInspiration, McKay and Lee were signed by WWE in 2015 after working a tryout in Australia the prior year. Lee noted how it was a scary time being let go from WWE because they were not citizens of the United States. If you're familiar with this story, we spoke about it extensively here on the channel when we were talking about could the IInspiration, the Iconics, could they end up in Impact Wrestling? They couldn't do anything. They literally could not do anything until about October of this year. From April to October, they could not earn a single penny from pro wrestling. They weren't legally permitted to do so. They didn't have work visas. They didn't have green cards. They had obviously this sort of, I don't know what it's called, extension period because they were working with WWE. But once that contract ended, they were kind of stuck. They needed to figure it all out all over again. And because they're not citizens of the United States and all that kind of stuff. So they even started a podcast that they couldn't earn money from just as something to do. That's why it took so long for them to land in Impact Wrestling. I think people thought they'd show up in July at Slammiversary. They couldn't. Legally, they couldn't. They probably would have loved to. And Impact Wrestling probably would have loved them to, but they couldn't. And especially with COVID and all that kind of stuff, the whole issue when it comes to work visas, immigration is so extended because of the backlog. It took them ages. So this is what they had to say, quote, it was a very scary time when we were let go, especially when we were not US citizens. Every decision we made impacted our future, so this created a very daunting time. WWE has an incredible platform and an amazing brand, but our success is now in our hands. We're building something bigger, different, something that belongs to us. Now, of course, the IInspiration debuted with Impact Wrestling at Bound for Glory in October, defeating Havoc and Rosemary to become the new Knockouts Tag Team Champions. McKay commented how coming to Impact felt natural for the former WWE Women's Tag Team Champions, and they're now focused on adding prestige to the bouts. She said, quote, we're so grateful to be champions of the best women's tag team division in the world. When we were free agents, the more Cassie and I discussed our options, the more Impact felt like the natural decision for us. We wanted to be with a company that has a certain production level and roster. This is Impact. It's been a great journey so far, and it's just getting started. And again, I'm very happy for them. I think that they were so underutilized in WWE. I think even at the time, splitting them up was ludicrous, and especially the way they did it, just randomly on an episode of Raw, was nuts. And then the plan was to push Peyton Royce. They never did. They never did. If anything, Billie Kay got pushed more on SmackDown, and she got over in spite of WWE with the gimmick of handing out her CV, her resume to people. And I feel for her because I think if there was a live crowd present at the time, she'd probably still be with the company because she'd be so over. She was so over on social media, but because they were in the Thunderdome, they didn't have that reaction that they would have got in front of a live crowd. So it was incredibly unfortunate. But everything happens for a reason, and them being back together is to Impact's benefit, and they're both benefit. As they said, I think they're probably part of the best women's tag team division in the world because unfortunately there aren't many. And that's why I felt when the Iconics were released, and we were talking about this time and time again here on the channel, that I felt that they were such a perfect fit for Impact Wrestling because they could go to AEW, of course they could, but I didn't see the fit. And I understand that, of course, you've got Peyton Royce and Shawn Spears and all that kind of connection there. But if you want to go somewhere as a female tag team that's got a very good women's tag team division that's treated as actual proper women's tag teams, not like in WWE with two singles people thrown together and no real tag teams, it's legit, it's legitimate, and they're thriving there. I think the next step for Impact is to bring in more tag teams and establish more tag teams and have them team together for a prolonged period of time. They're doing that right now, but they can always, there's always room for improvement. So I'm very excited still. I think they've only scratched the surface, and it's going to be fascinating to see what they do in Impact Wrestling. Finally, I want to talk about WrestleHouse. Now, WrestleHouse 2 aired during Thanksgiving week, and there's some notes behind sort of the production style of it, and we didn't touch on it because it's been crazy at the moment for me. But last week's Thanksgiving, or the prior week rather, edition of Impact Wrestling saw the return to the bizarre WrestleHouse, an event that saw, and this is real, mind control, time travel, and Hernandez thinking he was still in LAX with Homicide and Conan. An episode that had so many moving parts would have required quite a lot of work and shoots to pull it off. And our report from PW Insider's Mike Johnson has detailed just how intensive this production was. This is what Johnson said, quote, "Last week's Impact Wrestling episode was 100% based around WrestleHouse 2. That was a grueling shoot as everything was done over 2 days in Vegas. All the matches were shot on day one, and then the second day was a long day as they had to shoot all the scenes plus multiple camera angles for the different reaction shots, etc. We are told it was a long, tiring shoot for everyone involved. If you're wondering why Ross Foreman's voice sounded the way it did, it's because he'd lost it, and even after the production realized that, they decided it would make the segments better as it was even weirder." Look, WrestleHouse, when it was done in the pandemic, I praised. I did, and I think to this day, I think it was creative. I think it was different. I think they made a best out of the bad situation. And obviously the pandemic, they did something cinematic and it worked. And it wasn't the entire show as well. It was segments during shows. And they were gone for several weeks. And then eventually they came back. And yes, it's wacky. And yes, it's surreal, and yes, it's over the top and all that kind of stuff, but that's what Impact does. That's kind of Impact Wrestling comedy. They've got this sort of genre that really they've delved into over the course of the last few years, and a lot of people like it. Some people hate it, but it is what it is, and I think it makes Impact stand out. And again, I really did praise Impact in 2020 because I felt it worked. I felt it really worked, and they got to the point of doing the whole Rosemary, Johnny Bravo romance, and eventually they had the wedding. It worked. It was good. This time round, I just don't think it worked. I don't think it worked, and I don't know if it's because the entire show, maybe if they'd done what they did previously and spliced it up, cut it up, and had usual matches going on in between and an actual Impact Wrestling episode. I know they had matches and all that kind of stuff, but I think if they'd have followed a similar format to what they did before, maybe they would have got away with it. Or maybe it's just a case of, this is kind of my feeling on cinematic matches in general at this point, that we got a lifetime's worth of cinematic matches in 2020, and I have no interest in seeing cinematic stuff really for a long, long time now, because we got our fill, and it was done by necessity in 2020 because there were no fans, the pandemic, all that kind of stuff, but we've got fans back now, and we've moved back on, and pro wrestling is still evolving, and I just think that kind of content from pro wrestling, not that it belongs in the past, but it should never be seen again, because I don't think that's fair. I do think there was a place for it, but it just didn't work for me. And I know some people might have liked it, and again, I liked the initial WrestleHouse, but this one, it just didn't work for me. And the ratings weren't great anyway, but that's because it was Thanksgiving, so it is what it is. But look, guys, as always, it's just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on all of Impact Wrestling's news stories today? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about Impact Wrestling, AEW, WWE, New Japan Pro Wrestling, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved in the community, drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash the like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube, get the rankings, and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right-hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video, along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or have you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.